Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to be talking to you today about this week's reading for Yukoku. That is the rough translation of the word patriotism in Japanese. They have some other connotations that are associated with it, but overall, uh, that's basically what it means. So I mentioned a lot of Mishima's information last class when I was talking about not only his history, but the history of Japan right before he was born up until the point where he died. And one thing that was incredibly important to Mishima was the militarism of Japan in post-Shogun Japan, which starts in the late 1800s with the Emperor Meiji. And what happens, or at least the focus of this story, not only the story but the film version, is something called the 226 incident. And this was in 1936. And a lot of times when people, especially when Americans think of World War II, they have the dates of 1941 to 1945 associated with that. And that's because, that's when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and then when we dropped the atomic bombs in 1945, that eventually ended the war in the Pacific. The war in the Atlantic ended before that. But for the Japanese, they had had a long succession of battles before they attacked the United States. So for them, with all the two wars that they conducted against China and the war they conducted against Russia, they were already considered to be at war in 1936. And what was happening was, and I mentioned this last class, that there was a big divide between the people who sided primarily with the emperor and the people who sided primarily with the government. And the military was on the side of the emperor, because as I mentioned, when they took an oath to protect Japan, they were really taking an oath to protect the emperor, because the emperor was seen as the embodiment of Japan. So the soldiers of the army were always under primarily the authority of the emperor, except for the fact that it was the Japanese government that was making the majority of the decisions about everyday functions of Japanese society, the laws and so on. So one of the things that upset the soldiers in the army was the way that the general population were treated, and especially the farmers in Japan. Farmers have always been considered to be kind of lower caste citizens in Japan, even though they are incredibly important because that's where you get your food from. But they had, very little opportunity for land ownership. Basically everything that they grew, they had to turn over to the state for very little money, so farmers were not making any kind of profit. And a lot of the soldiers that were in the standing army, came from the countrysides, and came from fishing villages, and had a lot of ties to agriculture. So they were very sympathetic to the farmers and the everyday people. So when the government would continue to heavily tax farming and other kind of blue-collar industries, this would make the people in the Japanese army angrier and angrier, and they overall felt that it was important to establish the emperor as the main force in Japanese society, regardless of whether the emperor wanted that or not, because the emperor is more seen like as a figurehead. So when you have that conflict, you have this group of officers that get together, and they were primarily from what was happening over in Manchuria, or while the Japanese were occupying it, Manchukuo. And a whole bunch of them got together and said, you know what, this just isn't good, we need to put the emperor in charge, we need to go take over the government in a military coup and establish the emperor as our primary leader, and the emperor will, of course, take much better care of the population than these awful politicians. So that's what the 226 incident was about, and Mishima explains this at the very beginning of the story, and also of the movie, that you had this one author, you had this one soldier, Lieutenant Shinji, and he was part of this group that was the radicals that were in support of the emperor. And because he had recently been married, these officers kind of excluded Shinji from their plans for this military coup. So on the day that the military coup happened, which is February 26th in 1936, these guys went and they took over the government, and they held a lot of politicians hostage. They killed some of the politicians, and Shinji's group or battalion or platoon was called up to go and try to put down the uprising, put down the coup. Most of what you see here I've already just talked about, but the thing was, the soldiers were appealing to the emperor as this military coup was going on, and saying, will you go ahead and take your rightful place? Will you show that what we're doing is meant for you? And if you don't like what we're doing as soldiers, will you tell us that you want us to stop? And the emperor wrung his hands for a couple of days on this, because he liked the fact that the soldiers were loyal to him, and he certainly didn't want to put that down. But at the same time, the Diet was the ones that were controlling the government. So for the soldiers to be acting against the government, that's treasonous. So after a few days, the emperor told the soldiers to stand down, that he didn't like what they were doing. And so some of them committed suicide, some of them a lot of them, the majority of them, were arrested, and some of them were subsequently killed after a trial. But it was a huge letdown for the military. They felt it as a kind of betrayal that the emperor didn't back them. And this is something that will continue to eat at Mishima, because the emperor that's in control at the time of this incident was the Emperor Showa, Hirohito, who eventually will take them into, the majority of World War II, and who after the war will say that he is not a divinity, that he is just a regular everyday person. Japan was under martial law for 5 months because of that, which really kind of brought everything in Tokyo to a standstill. So the reason why these officers in the group that Shinji is in exclude him is because he is just recently married to Riko, and they didn't want to put him in any danger that would have him be killed, because they knew how important their relationship was. And Shinji kind of felt betrayed by this, because, he kind of felt, first and foremost, he was married to the emperor and married to the army, which is why there's this big deal at the beginning of the story about how, if he ever has to commit, or if he ever has to do anything that's odious to him, he will automatically choose suicide. And does she understand that? And she makes the gesture that not only will she understands that he needs to die, but also that she will accompany him to the afterlife. So when he is put in this situation that he either has to go in and capture and potentially kill his group of officers that he sides with, or to disobey the emperor's orders and not go in and refuse to take any action against these soldiers, he's like, well, I can't do either of those things because of my loyalties, so I'll just take the third option, which is to kill myself. So that way he doesn't have to betray his officer friends, and he doesn't have to betray the emperor. I already talked about this slide in class. But essentially, this was a really big deal, not only to the soldiers that were involved in the 226 incident, but also to all the soldiers who fought through and lived in World War II, and all the soldiers' families who experienced losses of either their brothers or their sons or their husbands during World War II. And this is why there's, an emphasis inside the story that every day before he goes off to work, Takayama and his wife bow to this little shrine. And these little shrines that are for your ancestors are common in Japanese households, where you have like this little shrine that has a memento or a keepsake or a small picture of people in your family who have passed away, that you venerate on a daily basis. You keep it clean, you burn incense. On some holidays you offer it things like fruit or sweets in order to, acknowledge your ancestors. This is just going into a little bit more about the plot, but the main part of what you see in this story, and one of the reasons why Mishima said, if you ever want to know something about me, all you have to do is read Patriotism, because it just gets right to what I'm about, was that it got into this notion of his that he felt was very significant, which is the relationship between sex and death. And what you have in the story is Takayama knows that he has to, or he's going to kill himself. His wife knows it too, and they have like a meal, a small meal, or actually, do they meet? I think they even forego the meal. They have some sake. He says, "Bring me some sake," and they make just mad, passionate love, and there's a very long discussion of them looking at each other's bodies for the last time and going over each other, kind of almost in a spiritual sense, not just a physical sense, but a spiritual sense. And they make love like they've never made love before, right before they kill themselves. And then, of course, there is a very long discussion of the physicality of killing themselves, too. And for Mishima, these two things were just right next to each other in the world of how important they were in people's lives, sex and death. And also the beauty of their bodies. He revels in describing what their bodies are like and how happy they are to be together. So that's just something that's just very central to all of Mishima's works, really. So, and you'll see this in the post that's for this week, but one of the things that's really amazing about this work, the literature part of this week's content, is just the kind of detail that he goes into when he's talking about not only their last moment of sex, but also their last moment of death. And it's very, very detailed, and some people actually find it to be very off-putting, very gruesome, the level of detail he goes into. And then, when you see the movie, when the movie premiered in France, there were people that fainted. There were people that ran out of the theater vomiting. There was some very, very strong reactions. Now, I've got 2 minutes left on my screencast-o-matic, so I'm going to go ahead forward as quickly as possible. And when I'm talking about adaptation in this class, this is kind of like, at least in my opinion, one of the most ultimate adaptations, and an author getting involved in the adaptation of their work, because he did literally everything for this movie. He produced it with his own money. He directed it. He designed the stage. He decided that he would put the setting as a no stage instead of like inside the house that he describes inside the story. He designed the costumes. He provided the music, the soundtrack that is the Love, Death, Liebestod theme from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. That was his record that you hear playing in the back. The little props that you see with his wife when she's looking at all the little animals that she has, he went out and bought all those props. He wasn't the cinematographer. He was definitely the screenwriter. He did his own translation from the work to screenplay. And of course, he couldn't play the female part in the story, but literally he did absolutely everything else for this movie. It's just really incredible. A little bit about the sword that he uses. It's customary for officers to have two swords, a long sword that you use for battle, and a short sword for not only close range battle, but also if you do have to commit suicide. And Mishima's wife, after he did kill himself in very much this way, had all the prints of the movie destroyed except for one that was found later in a little box in her house when she passed away, and Criterion was able to re-engineer it and put it out. I've got 10 seconds left, so I'm trying to do this really fast, but I'll talk a little bit more about this next week because I know I don't have a lot of time left. So I'll see you next week, and make sure